My name is Yassine Mukadam and I'm a Millennium Fellow and a Campus Director at King's College London in the United Kingdom.
Hi everyone, my name is Makina Hack and I'm also a Campus Director and a Millennium Fellow at King's College London.
It is our great pleasure today to welcome you to today's Millennium Fellowship Webinar featuring Mr. Eric Nee. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Eric. For the next 50 minutes, we'll first have our moderated dialogue for around 15 minutes with Mr. Nee. For the remaining half an hour, we will open it up for a Q&A, so you can ask as many questions as you want to Mr. Nee, as long as he's happy.
Yeah, no. Please remember to mute yourself when you're not speaking, and throughout the webinar, type your introductions and questions in the chat box. We see new faces that have joined. Welcome. Please introduce yourself by writing down your name, university, and country down in the chat box. It's wonderful seeing so many faces here from all around the world. Let's go ahead and begin now. So, to start today's talk, we would like to introduce Mr. Nee.
So just a bit of background about Mr. Nee. For the last 13 years, Mr. Eric Nee has served as the Editor-in-Chief of Stanford Social Innovation Review, aka the SSIR, published by the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford University. SSIR produces a quarterly magazine, website, webinars, and conferences, all serving leaders of organizations engaged in social change from around the world. Mr. Nee is also the co-host of the Social Innovation Conversations podcast channel. He has served as a member of the committee encouraging corporate philanthropy's advising committee, a judge for the Social Venture Network's Innovation Award, and a judge for the Business Association of Stanford Entrepreneurial Student Social E-Challenge.
Yeah, Mr. Nee has more than 30 years of experience in the publishing industry. Before joining Stanford University, he was a senior writer for Fortune, covering the technology industry. While there, Nee helped Time Incorporated launch eCompany Now, where he was the executive editor, which later merged with Business 2.0. Before joining Fortune, he launched Forbes Silicon Valley Bureau, where he was bureau manager. And he also served as editor-in-chief of Upside magazine for close to 5 years. He was West Coast bureau chief for Computer Systems News, a reporter for Electronic News, and a reporter for MIS News on Miss News. Nee is the author of the book Information for Everyone, The Applied Materials Story. He has won numerous awards, including being named as one of the most influential technology journalists by Technology Marketing in 1997, 98, 99, 2000, and 2001. Welcome, Mr. Nee. It's a pleasure having you today.
Well, thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here with all of you to talk a little bit about SSIR, talk a little bit about social change, and whatever else you're interested in talking about during the Q&A. So do you want me to get started, or are you going to ask some questions? It looks like
let's ask some questions. Yassine, do you have any questions to ask?
So before we go to questions, I think it'll be best if you get started, and then after your talk, we'll give some questions. How does that sound?
Sure. Well, you had sent me over a few questions that you want me to talk about, and I think the suggestion was that I start by giving maybe a few minutes about SSIR, our history and what it is that we do. Should we start with that?
Yeah, no, that would be great.
Okay, great. Well, again, thanks for inviting me to speak. As was said, I've been here at SSIR for 13 years. The publication actually started back in 2003, 16 years ago, at the business school at Stanford University. And it's always good if you're talking about an organization trying to engage in social change to talk about our mission. So I'll just give our mission statement, which is one sentence, but does a pretty good job describing what it is that we're trying to do. So our mission is to advance, educate, and inspire the field of social innovation by seeking out, cultivating, and disseminating, i.e. publishing, the best in research and practice-based knowledge. So there's a lot in there, but basically we are a media organization that's trying to advance the field of social innovation by being a platform for people engaged in the field to talk about their work, talk about their learnings, their new ideas, both from a research perspective, but also practice. So we are published at Stanford University, but our audience are people out in the field of social innovation. So that's kind of a somewhat unique thing, at least in the US. There's a few other publications published by universities that are like that. Probably the best known is Harvard Business Review. It's published by Harvard University Business School, but the audience are business people. There's also MIT Technology Review, which is published by MIT, but seeks to advance the field of technology by reaching out to people beyond. So we are like that. We're not as nearly as well known or as large or as old as those publications, but the field of social innovation is somewhat new. So I think we're, you know, over the last 16 years, we've done a lot to advance it. There's a couple of things I want to point out that are somewhat different about what we do. One is that we are cross-sector. So we believe that social innovation, social change has to occur in all parts of society, government, business, and civil society, in other words, nonprofits. There are other publications out there that just serve one of those niches, you know, philanthropy or nonprofits or business. We cut across all those sectors. Our audience and the kind of articles that we write and our writers come from all those sectors. Another thing that's sort of different about us is while we do use some freelance journalists, we don't have any journalists on staff. We are all editors. And so our writers are people from the field itself. So one way to think about it is a peer-to-peer learning platform. The writers of our articles and the people that speak at our conferences and on our webinars are the very same people in our audience. And so let me take a couple minutes to describe who our audience are. Like I said, they come from all sectors of society. They're engaged in all kinds of issues. So from climate change and the environment and conservation to poverty, food scarcity, also arts. They are highly educated audience, which I like because it means that we can write at a pretty high level. It's kind of an amazing stat, but about 75% of our audience are people with an advanced degree. It's also a global audience. So I noticed we have people here from around the world. Our audience is similar. On our website, which is an English-only website, 45% of the people who come to read us come from outside the US. So you can imagine, given that we're English language, you know, the big numbers of that come from Canada, the UK, India, South Africa, Australia, but we also have readers literally throughout the world. We also have foreign language editions. So we have a Chinese language edition published by a partner in Beijing. We have a Korean language edition published by a partner in Seoul. And we are about to launch a Portuguese language edition out of Sao Paulo aimed primarily at Brazil, and a Spanish language edition aimed out of Mexico, aimed at Latin America. And we are in talks to produce a Japanese language edition and an Arabic language edition. So I expect all those to happen over the next year. So once that occurs, we'll be able to really say we are a global publication. We also aim at leaders of organizations. So we do that because we think that's the place where we can have kind of the biggest impact of what we do, because leaders of organizations obviously have major influence over what those organizations are doing and their trajectory. So let me just talk for a second about what it is that we try to do. So I think I mentioned we have a magazine We have online articles. We do conferences. We do webinars. We have podcasts. So we have really the full complement of media. We do some video, not a lot of video. But we do that for a couple of reasons. One is different people like to read and access information in different ways. So we think it's really important to meet people where they at. Another reason is that we are a social enterprise, if you want to call it that. Virtually all of our budget comes from earned income. We're part of Stanford, but Stanford doesn't give us any money. We charge money to subscribe to the public. And if you want to attend our conference, we're basically like a media organization nestled within a university. We have our webinars are all paid, and they attract around 10,000 people every year. So what is it we're trying to do? There's 5 things I want to focus on. One is we really try to bring forth new ideas and approaches, hence the name Social Innovation. So we're about, new and innovative ways to tackle social problems. But we don't stop there. We don't think it's enough to just put forward ideas and then walk away. We also spend quite a bit of time critically examining new ideas and existing ideas and approaches. Another thing that we do is we have kind of straight up management articles, because we think, if organizations aren't well run, then, all the innovative ideas in the world aren't going to get you very far. So we have a lot of articles on management issues, leadership, governance, marketing, kind of both that would learn in a business school. We also, although academics aren't our audience, aren't our target audience, in fact, they do read it. And part of what we see ourselves doing is sort of advancing the field of social innovation. We're not a peer-to-peer reviewed journal like, traditional academic journal, but a lot of academics read us, and more important, they use it in their teaching. So a lot of courses, particularly for undergraduates, on these subjects will use some of our articles because they're pretty rigorous, and I think fair to say some of the best articles written on any variety of topics. And then the last thing we're trying to do, which I mentioned, is really create a global learning community. We believe that social change and social innovation, it is clearly a global phenomenon. There are things that one can learn globally. Impact investing, for example, is something that is a general phenomena that you see around the world. How it gets implemented in any particular region or country is going to vary. But we think there's a lot of things people can learn from one another around the globe, which is the reason that one of the benefits of being cross-sector is we think there's things that people can learn from different sectors. There's been a lot of cross-fertilization between the business community and the nonprofit community in the last decade or so, things like impact investing. So we think there's learning there. And then, learning across fields. So we really want to be that global learning platform. So I'll stop there. I think that's a pretty good overview of what we do and how we do it and why we're doing it.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was a fantastic overview. I've noticed that you mentioned social innovation quite often. How would you sort of describe to the audience what constitutes social innovation? And following on from that, how does the sector of social innovation differ from social impact?
So I get that question a lot. It's in our title, Stanford Social Innovation Review. So people want to know what we do have, kind of a formal definition, which stems from an article we published about 10 years ago called Rediscovering Social Innovation. So I'll just read that out to you, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So we define it as a novel solution, hence innovation, to a social problem that's either more effective, more efficient, more sustainable, or fairer compared to existing solutions. And then the last part is important, and which generates value primarily for society rather than single individuals or organizations. So let me just unpack that a bit. You know, one question I get a lot from people is, well, the iPhone, wasn't that a social innovation? Or Uber, isn't that a social innovation? It's certainly an innovation that impacted society. So, but the reason we wouldn't call those social innovations is because of a couple of things. One, the control of those platforms is under private hands, right? Apple and Uber. The primary motivation for each of those companies is to make a profit. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's not, the motivation isn't to benefit society, it's to benefit the shareholders. And you can see that play out in some of the decision making, right? I mean, Uber's been rightly criticized for kind of running roughshod over cities and governments and their own employees. If you could imagine if someone had instead developed a platform that would connect people that have cars and are willing to share them with people that need a ride, but it was run collectively for the benefit of the community and for the benefit of the riders, it would look much different and it would behave much differently than Uber. So I think that's a really, I stress that point because I think that's what distinguishes social innovation from just innovation itself. In terms of how does it differ from social impact, you know, all things have an impact, right? Not all, but many things have an impact on society. So could be positive, could be negative. I think you're talking about positive social impact. You know, when you get down to it, I wouldn't argue over the differences. I think sometimes we can get caught up in definitions. I think, you know, if people are thinking about positive social impact, you know, similarly to what I described, social innovation, I think they're, you know, can be almost interchangeable terms. I mean, I think social innovation, just to come back to that term again, an innovation by itself might be interesting, but unless it has impact, it's not important. And unless it can be scaled in some way to deal with the size of the problem, it's also not important. And I think unless it can be sustained over time, right? Unless it has some kind of financial model that allows it to continue, it's not important. So, I mean, the title of our publication is Social Innovation, but I think sometimes people get overly enamored with the innovation part and they forget about what's the purpose. It's to have, you know, an impact on society, positive outcomes. And sometimes people forget about those other two things, scaling and sustainability. And those are, I think, equally important to the innovation itself. And you see that a lot where people come up with, you know, great ideas, but there's something called the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. It was a great model for how one can, this guy Jeffrey Canada, and he got a lot of support, financial support from people, the Wall Street community, hedge fund people in New York for what he was doing, because it was a very inclusive model. It looked at all parts of within Harlem, what are all the things that affect children and how can we improve the life for them? It was a great model, except that it could not be scaled because the amount of money that was pouring into that one small area, you could not take that and replicate it even throughout New York City, let alone New York or the rest of the country. So I think, you know, and it got a lot of attention and people learned from it and people took elements of what was going on there and kind of took it around the world. But I think one has to be careful about getting overly enamored with of some small pilot that looks terrific, but that you can't scale to the problem.
Yeah, no, you make a very interesting point there. So my next question for you is that in 2011 at the Collective Impact Conference, you mentioned that SSIR's goal is to inspire and guide social innovation by bringing up the idea of collective impact to the social sector. So the question I have for you is, what role do you see that students and young people play in creating collective action and pursuing a career in the social sector?
Mm-hmm. Well, several things. I think young people can obviously participate in organizations, either, you know, during the summer as on fellowship, you know, assuming they're still in school. They can obviously even be the catalyst for movements. So I think, you know, it's kind of obvious, but, you know, Greta Thunberg from Sweden, not like climate change and activities around climate action hadn't been going on, but she brought this new energy that often young people will bring in, kind of urgency to a problem, and even kind of unwillingness to compromise, which I think all of which are needed to make change. And I mean, I think that's, you know, currently, you know, that's a terrific example, but you can look back throughout history where, you know, young people led movements, you know, 1968 around the world. And today you're seeing that in Hong Kong. So, I mean, I think young people play an incredible role in those kind of activist social movements. And then, you know, within existing organizations, you know, bringing in new ideas to the organizations that they work with is, I think, you know, really important. And those are a couple ideas.
Thanks for that. Millennium Fellows are at the beginning of their social impact careers currently. What concrete advice do you have for us, especially those that are using research and writing as a means to promoting the SDGs that they're promoting?
Sure. Well, let me just start by giving a little bit of my personal history, because that might be somewhat illustrative. So I was talking about, you know, young people providing energy, etc. So when I was growing up, the Vietnam War was kind of at its height in the late 60s. I started getting involved in anti-Vietnam War activities when I was in high school. Part of it was because I was facing the draft. And so there was sort of an urgency because it was going to impact me personally. But also there was a lot of things going on in my life that led me to understand and be aware of social injustice. I was living in San Diego at the time and traveling to Tijuana and seeing that when you simply cross a border, man-made border, suddenly life was very different in Mexico than it was in San Diego. And for some kid, you know, that had grown up in the Midwest or in middle-class life and everything, you know, that was my whole outlook on world. It caused me to see the world in a different way. So throughout college, I was very involved in the new left in the US. I ended up joining a socialist organization called New American Movement. I ended up being on the executive committee of that. I was doing labor organizing, community organizing, a variety of things. That was all very important, but I felt that at that time, I felt the only way that one could tackle injustice was to do it directly, head on, by being engaged on the ground, grassroots. You can certainly do that, but personally, I felt that that wasn't the best use of my skills. So I ended up going to journalism school, becoming a journalist, and then had kind of this sideways move, really, because you mentioned during my bio that I spent about 15 years covering Silicon Valley. So it initially was really kind of odd for me, being a Marxist, to be writing about business. I think it helped give me a critical eye to do it, but it was a funny path, right? I was professionally, I was a journalist, but I was writing about business for Forbes which had the subtitle, The Capitalist Tool. So it was a point in my life when I felt really like I wasn't really sure what I was doing. So I left Forbes, went to Fortune, and then eventually came over here where I found that I could be engaged in social change by editing a publication and using the kind of intellectual skills that I liked and valued, but in a positive way, as opposed to working as a nurse's aide in nursing homes, which, while it was valuable and I was engaged in organizing people into unions, was just tough on me emotionally and intellectually. So that's all by way of saying I think there's a lot of paths one can take. I don't think it means that one has to be directly engaged in activist work. I don't think you even have to necessarily work at a NGO or a organization directly involved. I think people can play important roles in changing society in a variety of places. I think you look at businesses now, they're beginning to move more in the direction of being aware of and trying to take action on social issues. And if someone can be inside a large business and be pushing for that, and there's room to push for that, I think that can be important. One can be a lawyer and do pro bono work. One can be a journalist, which kind of gets to the role of, research and writing. I think journalism can be an incredible vehicle for doing this. When I started off as a journalist, the role that at least most people had was Watergate, right? You kind of go out there and you find something corrupt or unjust and you expose it, which is important, but it doesn't get at how you change things. And so there's a new trend in journalism called solutions journalism that I would say SSIR is a part of. And there's actually a group called Solutions Journalism Network that has journalists from around the world engaged in all kinds of, small and large organizations, looking at journalism as a tool not just to expose problems, but to talk about how one can solve them. Certainly, academia, there's a huge amount of room for writing and research, think tanks, et cetera. But even in, regular, foundations, nonprofits, research and writing are both becoming more and more important because more and more organizations are approaching social change, not just from the heart, but from the head. And so research is super important to all these organizations. Is the approach you're taking working? Are you not just looking at outputs, but looking at outcomes? And then being able to write and communicate that to people, marketing, branding, social media, all these things that involve writing, I think are literally more important than any place. And I think there's just a huge number of avenues one can pursue if you've got skills in research and writing.
No, thank you so much, Mr. Nee. So for the next portion of the webinar, we will now proceed to the question and answer portion. If you have a question for Mr. Nee, please ask it in the chat box. Remember to stay muted for this portion of the call. However, if we do pick your question, please unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your question.
So do I just look at the chat box and pick up questions, or are you gonna pick them up and ask them of me?
I don't know, I don't mind doing 50-50. Wait, I think I meant to pick them actually, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, Gabriel Garcia, I can see your question. Gabriel, would you mind unmuting yourself, introducing yourself, and asking the question?
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Sorry, it was not working, but now it is. My question is, so you talked just in your last question about kind of that idea that you can do social innovation from really any sector, especially from within organizations. So I was wondering what role you see diversity and inclusion, specifically like departments playing within changing businesses' outlooks to better value difference and create belonging.
Well, I think it's it's a hugely important role. You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been something that's been, you know, out there since the civil rights movement, the women's movement. But I think there'd begun to be a bit of complacency about it, and also even amongst people in organizations that you thought might have made a change, hadn't made a change. And so the last few years, there's been a huge renewed focus on this, driven largely from the outside with things like the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter, that have really just been a kick in the butt to all kinds of organizations. But I think, having said that, I think many organizations now are interested in and willing to make those changes. And for that to happen, it has to be inside. There has to be people inside organizations leading the way, providing advice about how to do it. And so I think, yes, it's not going to be easy, but I think it's very important. For example, here at the university, at SSIR, you know, we've even had our issues with these questions, and we were looking for assistance about how do we think about these issues both internally and externally. And as it happens, Stanford had an office they'd created a couple of years ago on diversity, equity, inclusion that was specifically charged with helping different units within the university address those questions. So we went over to them, talked to them. They came over and did a couple of workshops with us that were really good and important, you know, kind of providing that advice within Stanford. It was, so they understood our institution. They kind of understand the language that we use, but also being, you know, kind of, these people view it as their mission to promote this. So they were very, you know, they were pushing us on some things. So it's a long way of saying, I think those kind of departments, you know, DEI departments that are increasingly you'll see within businesses and other organizations are important and can play a big role.
Any other questions? Just put them in the question box.
Okay, I'll just wait for someone else to put up a question. But in the meantime, I have a question of my own I'd like to ask you. Sure. So I've noticed that SSIR focuses on a cross-sector approach. How can the non-profit government, the non-profits, the government, and the private sector work together for social innovation to take place?
Well, a couple things. I think first, I don't think they always have to work together. I think sometimes there's been kind of a misunderstanding that we talk about blurring of the boundaries, as if the business world and the nonprofit world are somehow blurring. It'll all just be kind of one big happy family. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's even desirable. I think the nonprofit sector and the business sector, the nonprofit sector, for example, I think, you know, when you talk about governance, I mean, these are organizations that are, you know, the governance structure is one that's different than you see in a business. The motivations are different. I think at the edges, you're seeing some nonprofits use some kind of market-based techniques to solve social problems, and businesses starting to think social. But I think they each do have important roles to play. I think civil society having its own organizations representing its own interests is important, as distinct from government or as distinct from business. Having said that, I think that some of the big problems do require those organizations to work together. For example, housing. We're here in California. We've been blessed with a lot of economic prosperity, but one of the byproducts of that has been a really real escalation in housing prices, which has made it unaffordable for many people. The only way you're going to solve that is for government and business and the nonprofits to work together. So you need housing for low-income people. Well, business is not going to build that by itself because, you know, they're primarily interested in a profit, and if it's marginal to non-existent, they're not going to be interested. But you can get philanthropy to step in and provide funding that would subsidize the cost of the housing to make it more affordable. You can get government to come in and change some of the regulations to make it less expensive to build housing, or to maybe change the zoning. There are nonprofit housing organizations. So I think, you know, that's an example where it's necessary to get all the players involved to really tackle that problem.
Okay, thank you so much for answering the question. I think I can see in the comments that Jordan, I believe you had a question. Would you mind just unmuting yourself and introducing yourself to the speaker? Jordan, if you're still here, you can hear me. Would you mind unmuting yourself? Okay, you can't get it to work. Would you be okay? All right, you can't unmute yourself, I'm guessing. Would you be okay if I read out your question for you? Okay, lovely. So Jordan's question was, what do you think is the most effective way to teach the next generation of business leaders to invest in social innovation and capital? So perhaps, does that mean capitalism?
Well, I think business schools, we're talking about teaching. I think we're, you know, probably talking about business schools either at the undergrad or graduate level. Universities and academia are often one of the slowest institutions to change. You know, and part of that, at least in the US, is the tenure system, which I think has many benefits. It insulates people from political pressure, but what it also means is that the universities tend to be kind of overloaded with older people, older academics, or kind of a little bit complacent, have their own set of you know, things that they've been researching, and they're reluctant to go look at something new. And so I think what we're often seeing, at least like at Stanford and others, is that it's adjunct professors coming in to do the teaching, people from the field. A lot of it's student driven. You know, students saying, we want to have courses on sustainability, on social impact, on thinking about all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And I have seen some change here at Stanford, and we published about a year ago on MBA education and how it had to change. I think it is changing, but slowly. In the US, there's a group called Net Impact. It's been around for maybe 10 or so years. And they have an annual convening of about 2,000 to 3,000 students, undergrad and grad students from business schools who are interested in social change and social impact, which is, I think, amazing. I've been to it a couple times, and it's great to see. But I think, you know, except for there's some sort of outlier business schools that do nothing but focus on that social innovation, social change. Most business schools, that the majority of their curriculum is on sort of standard business stuff, and the social stuff is kind of an add-on, unfortunately. But I think it's changing, but I think it's changing slowly. And I think it's just incumbent upon students to just demand more, demand that it change, hold their own events, you know, have their own organizations, do some kind of self-education, to be honest. you know, and that's kind of the way changes always happen in universities. It's frequently driven by students or forces outside of the university rather than by the faculty.
I think we're having, sorry.
Yeah, I was saying we're having some sound issues. I couldn't hear you.
You can message whatever your questions are, or I think there's a few of the people in the chat who have suggested what they'd like to talk about as well. Okay, maybe while you can try and fix sound issues, Sulema Buza, would you like to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and mention the statement or question you had earlier? Sula, are you on right now? Okay. I think the audio isn't working, so I'm going to read out the question statement again, if that's okay. So what was said was, starting a social venture as a student often requires some guidance from a coach or mentor. To what extent should you take suggestions from them in terms of what to do, and how big you should start, and all the other factors that are necessary? Also, in addition to this, when going about social innovation, there are challenges in convincing community members in believing in us or using your solution idea, as they tend to dwell too much on traditional means to get the job done. Are there any suggestions that you may have for us in terms of how to go back to resolve these types of challenges?
Sure. So let me tackle the first question, first part of the question. It's sort of a tricky thing. I think certainly if someone's willing to lend you their knowledge, you know, and experience, I think you should always listen to them, because maybe I'm prejudiced given that I'm 65, but I do think there's things one can learn from people that have experience. That said, you know, any of the important, you know, thinking into the world of business, for example, any important, you know, kind of breakthrough that's happened has been despite what the general, you know, what most people would give you advice to do. And so I think having the conviction of your own, of yourself is super important. Let me give you an example. So SSIR, Stanford Social Innovation Review, was started by a woman. She wasn't part of the university. We just felt that there needed to be a publication like this. If she had gone to me, I would have said I wouldn't even try because of all the obstacles that one would face in starting up a new publication, particularly right at the same time that the internet was just starting to kind of really move along. It seemed like I would have said it was a terrible idea, but she just wasn't listening and went off and did it, and here we are, it's worked. So I think if you really believe in something, I think you should follow those beliefs and convictions, but with some knowledge in the background, you know, from you know, experience. So I think going off and asking for advice is always critical. So it's sort of a non-answer, but I think I don't think, you know, I think it's a balance. In terms of, you know, convincing community members about your solution, I think one issue that many social entrepreneurs often have is, you know, they'll come up with an idea, whether it's in the university or with a group of friends, and they think it's great, and then they'll go out to the community and, you know, try to implement it or offer it. That can work, but I think the better approach is one where you start by talking and being embedded in the community you're trying to serve, to understand what their needs are. And even if you've already got an idea in the background, I think you want to get their buy-in on it. And that sounds kind of manipulative, but I think, you know, kind of the design thinking approach or human-centered approach to solving problems is super important. I think if there's one thing we've learned in the last, you know, decade is that the importance of working within the community to get them engaged in coming up with the answers and the solutions themselves. because unless you have the community's buy-in, often you're not going to go anywhere. And also you can learn a lot of things from them. I think, you know, it's often underestimated. It's not as if people in the community may not know what the problems are, or even how to solve them. They simply may not have, you know, the means and the resources, or even kind of the idea that they can change things, right? I mean, often that's the impediment. People don't think things can change. And so someone coming in from the outside can often be that catalyst. But I think the important thing is to really start from the community, and then build up, rather than, you know, kind of the expert-driven approach where you come up with an idea and then go into the community and try to implement
it. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Nice to be back to working. Thank you so much for that answer. Now we've got another question from Yaelin Blackman Zamora. So Yaelin, can you unmute your mic for us, please? If your mic isn't working, we can read the question for you. Okay. Mr. Eric Nee, this is the question from Yaelin. You mentioned that initiatives and innovation should occur in all aspects of society. My fellows and I are working on a food security initiative on campus. What would be your best advice for us as we try to break the stigmas that come with being hungry? Thanks.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have a great answer to that. I do think, you know, social stigmas are very prevalent. And I think, you know, the issue of hunger is one that I think, so I don't know where Yaelin is from, but I know in the US and in California, for example, there's, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of publicity about the fact that many students, university students, are going hungry, which I think was a surprise to many people. It's a surprise to me, to be honest. I think that was kind of the first step, is like having the research out there that exposes what the issue is. And then how you get individual, you know, within the university community and even the larger community, to break through the social stigma of, you know, being hungry is a challenge. I think we've seen that, you know, like let's say with the Me Too movement around, you know, rape and sexual abuse. I think it was a huge thing for people, women, to begin saying, you know, this person raped me. And that was, I'm sure, very difficult for those individuals to do, but was an important thing in kind of making a public statement to get it out there and get the conversation going. So if you're talking about on an individual campus, I think, you know, finding creative ways and supportive ways for people that are experiencing this problem to go public with it. I don't know exactly what that would be, but I think it's necessary to kind of humanize the situation rather than it being abstract, is to have people know that this person who they know in class is going hungry, and people, and you know, they may not have realized it, but it's not an easy thing to do, I think, but I think it's a necessary thing to do, to have it to destigmatize the issue, and it's a difficult thing to do. I mean, on a university campus, I would think that, you know, that the environment is probably supportive, more or less, for that to happen. In the wider community, it becomes more difficult. I mean, we've got a president who's cutting food stamps, dehumanizing people that might be in need, you know, so that's a bigger issue. But I think if you start, you know, if you're looking at a campus initiative, I think it's certainly possible to make that. And often these things, you know, you're asking about the role of students. I mean, I think that's where, you know, many movements start is on university campuses where people are able to have an environment where they can step out and make statements and begin to do things that might be more difficult in the broader community, but then it kind of gathers momentum.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's an amazing way to answer the question. I found it quite inspiring myself. I think the next person that wanted to answer a question was Tendai Dara. Tendai, are you around?
Yes, I'm around. Thank you.
Lovely.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ali. I'm very impressed. I see you have over 35 years working experience in publishing, and which is so amazing. So I would like to ask, personally, I believe social innovation is the future, but there are so many fellows like me who are working on social innovation enterprises that are still starting. So what advice would you give us as fellows, and what are the opportunities that are there that we can explore in the social innovation sector? And lastly, as a follow-up question on this one, someone once said to me that there is always a digital solution to every problem. So how do you think we can incorporate technology in the implementation of SDGs? Thank you.
Sure. Let me just start with the last part. I think, you know, the social sector has been a bit behind the business sector in its use of digital technologies. But I think, you know, it's quite obvious that, I won't say every, but just about every solution that that people would be looking at. I mean, digital technology is just a part of our life today. And so it has to be part of the solution as well. You know, exactly how that happens is obviously going to vary from one organization to another. But I think we've seen a lot of creative ways of, say, mobilizing people through social media. Digital technology can also be a great way of measuring, you know, an evaluation, because many people either have, you know, smartphones or access to a smartphone that somebody else might have. And so being able to do inputs about, you know, about how they're doing, about their finances, about whatever it is you're trying to measure, that all becomes much easier than it used to be in the past, where that had to happen face to face. And there's been a lot of examples of really kind of, you know, interesting in, I say fintech, financial technology. There's a lot of things going on, even led in Africa, of using, bringing banking to people that were unbanked, and just kind of bypassing the whole network that we have in the US of, you know, branches and ATMs. Because of the absence of that, people have been really smart about using phones for payment and banking, probably, you know, in advance of much of what's going on in Europe or the US. So I think, I mean, I could go on and on about digital solutions. I think that they're clearly important, and, you know, pretty much anybody that's thinking about creating solutions should be thinking about how digital technology can be used. In terms of the first part of your question, I'm not sure I quite understood it. I think you were talking about, you know, how can one pursue, you know, social innovation. I mean, I think it's, you know, there's so many steps involved, but I think having, you know, the inspiration and the motivation to want to solve problems is the first step. I think going out into the community to best understand what the needs are is another important step. Thinking about clearly about your strategy and your theory of change and your financing model, all of those things. Not letting those necessarily get in the way, but I think you have to begin seriously thinking about those very early on. The other thing I would say, and it kind of harks back to some other stuff I said, is that if you want to improve society, it's great if you can, you know, I wouldn't dissuade anyone from going out and starting an organization, but that's not the only way that you can be engaged. You can work within existing organizations that are already doing good work. And that's also a place to learn, you know, and often, you know, even if you look at many of the, you know, important entrepreneurs that are out there, they often start off by working at some other organization, at a consulting firm or someplace where they can learn a lot before going off and starting their own organization. So I think giving some serious thought to that is always good advice.
Great. That's the wrap for all the questions for now. Thank you so much, Mr. Eric Nee, for taking the time to share your personal experiences and insights with us today. The fellows would love to keep in touch with you. What would be the best way to do this?
Well, a couple things. One, so sign up for our e-newsletter. It's free. We don't bother you a lot. But you can do that on our website, SSIR.org. A lot of the stuff that we do is freely available. I mentioned we have a business, you know, financial model, but a lot of the stuff that we do is freely available. The other thing is that, you know, my email, I'm always interested in hearing from people, and if you have our articles or ideas for articles, I'm always interested in that, and whatever. So my email address is my name, Eric Nee, ERICNEE, at Stanford, STANFORD.edu. So feel free to shoot an email. If you're, you know, out at Stanford, I can't guarantee I would be able to meet you in person, but I like to try to do that when I can. So if you're out this way, you know, let me know. And also, as you embark on your careers, you know, I think I would love to hear from you as you get out there and do work and are involved in organizations. Because this is, as everyone likes to say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So we're going to be here. I'm going to be here. So we'd love to hear from you in the future too.
Yeah, no, thank you again for giving such an amazing talk. I'd also like to thank all the Millennium Fellows who joined the webinar today. I hope you were able to gain some great insights, and we're looking forward to seeing you all again on the next webinar with Matt Swift this Wednesday. You can register on Crew on the Millennium Fellowship website, millenniumfellows.org. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.